Montana Territory, early spring of 1877, the morning sky was still bruised purple when Kierra Calhoun jumped from the back porch of her father's house barefoot, her breath hitching in the cold air, the bruises on her arms aching with every step through the frost-beaten grass. She did not look back. She would not. By the time the sun crested the mountains behind her, she had already crossed the creek and slipped into the woods, her worn satchel pressed tight to her chest. Inside it was a single change of clothes, a rusted pocketknife, and the last letter her mother ever wrote folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear. Kierra had no plan beyond running. She only knew she had to get away from her father before he made good on his threat to marry her off to a man twice her age in exchange for 3 barrels of whiskey and a new mule. Her feet bled by the time she reached the old cattle path that wound west through the basin. She followed it, half-starved and shaking, for 2 days before she collapsed near a fence line, the world swimming in and out of focus. That was where Beau Fletcher found her. Beau had been riding the outer edge of his range, checking on a calving cow stuck near the ravine. He spotted her lying beneath a cottonwood tree, her skirts torn, her arms scraped raw, and her eyes barely open. He swung down from his horse and knelt beside her. "Miss, can you hear me?" She blinked at him, lips cracked and dry. "Do not. Take me back." "I am not taking you anywhere but home," he said, lifting her gently. She flinched hard, but he did not let go. He just held her closer and said, "You are safe now." "I promise." Beau took her to his cabin on the east side of his 500-acre spread land he had worked for 7 years, building from nothing after the war, emptied his pockets, and left nothing behind but memory and calluses. He settled her in the spare room, fed her broth, and let her sleep. When Kierra woke the next morning, she found a folded shirt laid clean across the foot of the bed, a basin of warm water nearby, and the smell of coffee drifting in from the kitchen. She dressed slowly, her ribs tight from bruises, and stepped out into the main room. Beau was by the stove pouring 2 cups. "You are awake," he said, glancing back. "That is good." She hesitated by the wall. "You are safe here," he added, "and you can stay as long as you need." She nodded once. "Thank you." He offered her the cup. "You got a name, Kierra?" "I am Beau." They drank in silence. Over the next few days, Kierra watched him work from the front steps. Beau moved like someone who had spent his whole life with the land, steady, thoughtful, patient. He spoke little, but when he did, his words held weight. He fixed a broken fence post one morning with her watching, then handed her a hammer and said, "If you want to learn, I can show you." She did. Her palms blistered, but she smiled for the first time in months. By the end of the week, Kierra was helping with morning chores. She fed the chickens, swept the porch, and even helped him mend a saddle strap. She had never worked beside a man without fear before. Beau never raised his voice, never looked at her like a thing to be owned. He treated her like someone worth listening to. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the barn, he handed her a piece of apple pie wrapped in cloth. "Made it last night. Figured you might like something sweet." She took it, staring at the crust with wide eyes. "I have not had pie since my mother passed." He nodded, not asking more. Kierra ate in silence, her throat thick. "Why are you being kind to me?" Beau leaned against the stall door, arms crossed. "You looked like you needed someone. I know what that feels like." She looked at him then, really looked. His hands were scarred, his jaw dark with stubble, and his eyes soft with something she had not seen in a long time, gentleness. That night, Kierra stood at the edge of the porch, watching the sun dip low behind the hills. Beau came up beside her, quiet as always. "You ever think about what you want?" he asked. "Now that you are free?" She nodded slowly. "I used to dream about a small place, chickens, maybe a garden, peace. I never thought I would make it out, but now I do not know." "Well," he said, "you are here now. And I would not mind some chickens." She turned to him, startled. He added, "Only if you want to stay, Kierra." Her breath caught. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not," he said, "and you never were." The words broke something in her. She reached out, touching his arm. He did not move away. Days passed, then a week, then 2. Kierra started laughing again, soft, surprised sounds that caught her off guard. Beau listened every time. He showed her how to ride better, how to trim hooves, how to read the sky before a storm. She painted the front door blue one afternoon just because he said it was her favorite color. One evening, as they sat on the porch with coffee in hand, she said, "You saved me." Beau looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe, but you are the one who ran." She set her cup down, heart pounding. "Still, what you gave me, it is more than just a rescue." He turned to her, his face lit by the last light. "What I gave you was a place. What I want to give you is more than that." Kierra blinked, unsure she had heard him right. "I want you to stay, Kierra, with me, not just because I found you, but because I care about you, more than I expected, more than I probably should." She stepped closer. "I have never felt safe with anyone before. Do you feel safe with me?" "Yes," she whispered. He reached for her hand, calloused fingers brushing hers. "Then stay. Build something with me." She leaned in, forehead resting against his chest. "I want to." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. The sky darkened around them, but neither moved. Her heart pounded with something new hope. The wind came sharp off the mountains that morning, tugging at the hem of Kierra's borrowed skirt as she stood near the paddock, watching Beau drive the yearlings into the smaller pen. His coat was dusted with hay and grit, his shoulders lined with the weight of early spring work, and she realized she'd never known the shape of quiet routine until now. He caught her watching, tipped his hat without a word, then turned back to the cattle. She stayed where she was, hands tucked into her sleeves, not from cold but from the strange flutter low in her belly that hadn't quite left since the night she'd leaned into him on the porch. Later, when the sun climbed higher and the frost melted off the fence rails, Beau came around the corner of the barn with a wooden box in his arms. He set it on the table outside the cabin and opened the lid. "Thought you might like a try at these," he said, pulling out a set of carving tools, the metal catching the light. Kierra stepped closer. "You carve?" "Sometimes, when the days get long or the weather turns bad. Helps to keep the hands busy." She picked up a thin-bladed knife, turning it over in her palm. "I used to draw, on scraps mostly. My mother said I had the eye for it, but my father said it was a waste." Beau didn't answer right away. He took a block of pine from the bottom of the box and handed it to her. "You've got steady hands. Try something?" She sat at the table, the wood warm from the sun, and started to etch a curve into the surface, her thumb pressed against the grain, guiding the blade slowly. Beau sat across from her, working on his own piece, a length of cottonwood he began shaping into something she couldn't yet guess. They didn't speak much. The only sounds were the scrape of metal on wood, the low shuffle of horses nearby, and the distant rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. She liked it that way. It made everything feel more real. By late afternoon, she had the beginning of a bird's wing traced into the block. "I didn't ruin it," she said, surprised. "I didn't think you would." She tilted her head. "You always talk like you've got the truth tucked in your pocket." He smiled, slow and quiet. "Truth's not hard to find. Most folks just don't look for it." That evening, while Beau fixed the latch on the smokehouse door, Kierra walked the edge of the field behind the cabin. She found a nest tucked low in the brush, 3 speckled eggs safe inside. She didn't touch it, only knelt to look. Her knees pressed into the cold earth and something in her chest steadied. When she returned, Beau was setting a pot of beans on the stove. He didn't ask where she'd gone. "Over supper," she said, "do you think a person can be made new this far into their life?" He looked at her, spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "You're not old." "I feel older than I should." He set the spoon down. "You're not broken, Kierra, you've been hurt." "That's different." She let that settle between them. Then quietly, "My father started drinking harder after the war. My mother tried to keep things steady, but he'd come home with fists some nights. I used to hide under the porch. When she died, there was no one left to stop him." Beau didn't reach for her. He just listened. "I stayed because I didn't know where else to go. I ran because he promised me to a neighbor who wanted a cook and a bed, not a wife. You didn't let him finish the promise." "That counts." She looked at him then, really looked. "Why haven't you asked me to leave?" "Because I don't want you to." She pushed her bowl away. "You hardly know me." "I know enough. I've seen the way you work, the way you don't flinch from hard things. That tells me more than talk ever could." Kierra rose and stepped to the door, staring out into the dark where the trees stood like sentinels. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." "You don't have to be," he said. She turned, her voice steady. If I stay, Beau, I need to do more than sweep floors. He stood, walked toward her with careful steps. Then we'll build this place together. She reached for his hand, not tentative this time, their fingers laced without hesitation. Outside, the wind had quieted. Inside, the air warmed with something unspoken, but understood. That night, she slept with her carving tucked beside the bed, not because it was finished, but because it was hers. And in the other room, Beau sat by the fire, working another curl of cottonwood into shape, a figure slowly forming in his hands. The snowmelt had softened the ground by April, turning the back trail to the northern pasture into a ribbon of mud and standing water. Kierra stood on the edge of it, skirts pinned up at the knee, boots caked, holding a coil of rope Beau had handed her that morning with a raised brow and a quiet, "Time to teach you how to catch a horse that don't want catching." The bay mare they were after had thrown a shoe and taken to sulking at the far end of the field. Kierra followed Beau's lead, mimicking the shift of his weight, the slow way he approached, giving the animal space without surrender. "You watch her ears," he said, not looking back. "She'll tell you before she bolts." Kierra flexed her fingers around the rope. "And if she bolts anyway, you don't chase, you wait. Let her decide to come." They moved in silence after that, the only sound the squelch of their boots and the distant tapping of a woodpecker in the trees. When the mare finally let Beau step close enough to loop the line over her neck, Kierra exhaled and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "She trusts you," she said. He nodded once. "Takes time. But it's worth it." They walked the horse back together, Beau holding the lead while Kierra kept pace beside him. The wind carried the smell of damp cedar and thawing earth. She breathed deep. "I've been thinking," she said. "I want to put in rows behind the cabin, potatoes, maybe some beans. Something that grows honest and feeds more than just one season." Beau didn't answer right away. When he did, his tone was careful. "You want to stay through the planting," she glanced up. "I was hoping to stay through the harvest." He stopped walking. The mare shifted behind him, tugging at the rope, but he didn't move. "You sure?" he asked. "I am." They finished the walk back without another word, but that night, as she rinsed the last of the dishes and dried her hands on the hem of her apron, she found a folded piece of paper on the table. A rough sketch of the land behind the house. Rows drawn in pencil, neatly measured. At the bottom, in his careful hand, "We can start tomorrow." The next morning, Beau hitched the plow and showed her how to guide the mule without pulling too sharp. She walked behind, dragging a stick to mark her rows, her hands blistered by midday, her back aching in a way that felt earned. They worked until the sun dropped behind the trees, and the first of the frogs began calling from the creek. Kierra leaned on the fence, her face streaked with dirt, her nails rimmed in soil, and watched the wind ripple across the turned ground. Beau stood beside her, arms crossed. "It'll grow." "I believe it," she said. He looked at her then, longer than usual, his gaze resting on her face like it had finally found something it had been searching for. "You ever think about what you'd call a place like this?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, brushing a curl from her brow. "I think it's still becoming," he nodded slowly. "So are we." That night, as the fire cracked low and the cabin settled into its usual hush, Kierra stepped into the doorway of Beau's room, not uncertain but steady. He looked up from the book in his lap, eyes meeting hers. "You said you wanted to build something together," she said. "I think we already are." He stood, crossing the room with quiet steps, and took her hands in his. "No doubt in my mind," he said. She reached up, cupping his jaw, her thumb brushing the edge of his stubble. "I want to be yours. Not just in words, in truth, in work, in everything that comes." "You already are," he said, his voice low. He kissed her slow and sure, like a promise sealed not in smoke or fire but in earth and sweat and time. When she woke the next morning, the sunrise poured gold across the floor. Beau was already outside, driving stakes into the garden rows. She wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped out barefoot onto the porch. The ground was still cool, but the air was warm. He looked up, smiled that quiet smile he gave only her, and said, "We've got a good start." She nodded, her throat thick with something she didn't need to name, because some things didn't need names to be real. They only needed to be built, steady and true, one morning at a time. Beau's cabin sat quiet beneath the early May sky, the roof patched now with new shakes, the garden behind it already sprouting green. A lark sang from the willow near the creek, and Kierra stood with her back to the house, one hand resting on the fence rail, watching the cattle drift toward the shade. She had a habit now of counting them each morning, making sure none wandered too far. Beau hadn't asked her to, she'd simply begun, and he hadn't stopped her. Inside, bread cooled on the table, the scent of it lingering in the doorway. Kierra had learned the knack of baking with Beau's old Dutch oven, and the loaves came out better each week, less guesswork, more knowing by feel. Her hands bore the burn of one mistake near the wrist, a thin line of pink that Beau had wrapped gently without comment. She traced it now with her thumb, not with regret, but with a quiet sense of having earned something. Beau came up behind her, steps soft over the grass. Marshall passed by while you were out back, said there's a man in town asking questions, tall, older, heavy-set, looking for a girl from the basin. Kierra didn't turn, but the muscles in her shoulders tightened. He give a name? No, Beau said. Didn't need to. She stared out across the pasture where the wind moved low through the grass. He won't find me here unless someone tells him. I don't think anyone will, Beau said. Marshall didn't seem inclined to help him. He used to be a friend of my father's, she said. They fought together in the war. That man, he's the one I was promised to. Beau's jaw worked, but he said nothing. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet long enough, it would all stay behind me. She turned to face him. I don't want to keep running. You won't have to, he said. Not while I've got ground to stand on. She nodded, but her eyes were still distant, pinned to something only she could see. That evening, when the sun had dipped behind the ridge and the chickens had roosted for the night, Beau brought out his saddle and oilcloth and sat on the porch to work the leather. Kierra joined him with her mending, stitching a torn hem on the curtain that hung over their washroom door. I've been thinking about the land past the creek, she said after a while. He didn't look up. What about it? It's good soil, and there's enough room to run more cattle, maybe even sheep, but it'll need clearing. Beau set the saddle aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You want to stay that long? I want more than staying, she said. I want to make something that lasts. He studied her face, the lamplight catching the curve of her cheek. You keep surprising me. Do I? You don't wait to be told your worth, you claim it. That's rare. She looked down at her stitches. I'm only just learning how. He reached for her hand, his fingers closing gently over hers. You'll teach me then, we'll learn together. The next morning they walked the land past the creek. The grass stood high and saplings had taken root where fire hadn't cleared it in years. Beau marked the trees he'd fell first, and Kierra tied lengths of cloth to the ones she wanted left standing. You've got an eye for it, he said, watching her choose. My mother used to walk the woods with me, she answered. She taught me what grows back and what never does. They worked until the sun climbed high, then returned for water and shade. Kierra boiled wild greens for supper with dried venison and a dash of salt they'd bartered for last month. They ate on the porch in the quiet, the woods humming behind them. Do you miss town? She asked. Beau shook his head. Too many folks talking, not enough listening. I never had use for it either. But I'd like someday to go and not be afraid. He reached across the table, his hand resting over hers. We'll go together when you're ready, she nodded, her throat tight with something unspoken. That night, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind rattled the shutters and rain beat down on the roof like 1,000 hoofbeats. Kierra sat up in bed, the old fear rising in her chest, too familiar to ignore. She crossed the narrow space between their bedrooms and paused at Beau's door. It was open. He looked up from where he sat on the edge of the bed. Couldn't sleep. She stepped inside. The wind sounds like boots on the porch. He pulled back the quilt without a word. She climbed in, her back to his chest, and he wrapped an arm around her, his hand resting over her ribs. The storm moved on before dawn, leaving the air sharp and clean. When Kierra woke, Beau was still beside her, his breathing slow and even. She lay still, listening to the heartbeat beneath her cheek, and thought, I am not running anymore, and she never would again. The midday sun threw long shadows across the cattle trail as Kierra knelt in the dirt, coaxing the last of the young tomato plants into the ground. Her sleeves were rolled, her braid falling loose over one shoulder, and her hands were stained the color of rusted clay. She didn't notice Beau at first, not until his boots creaked on the wooden slats of the porch behind her. "You're missing lunch," he said, voice low and even. She sat back on her heels and wiped her palms on her skirt. Didn't want to stop while the ground was soft. He came down the steps, crouched beside her, and gently pressed his thumb against a spot on her cheek she hadn't felt, dirt now gone. "You don't owe this land everything in one day. I like giving it something," she said. "It's the first place that's given anything back." Beau stood and offered his hand. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. He didn't let go right away. "You've been quiet since the man came through town," he said. "I've been thinking," she replied, brushing her braid over her shoulder. "If I'm going to stay, I want it to be for the right reasons." His brow furrowed. "What reasons do you mean?" "Not because I'm hiding," she said, meeting his eyes, "but because I belong here with you," he nodded, slow and steady. "You do." They ate under the awning, slices of cold cornbread with pickled onions and the last of the smoked ham. Kierra watched the way Beau's hand moved when he poured water into her tin cup, deliberate, careful. She hadn't noticed that detail before, and it struck her that even now, months in, she was still learning him. "You never talk about your folks," she said, breaking the quiet. He paused, then set his cup down. "My father died when I was 16. Fever took him before we knew what it was. My mother followed 3 winters later. I stayed on the land until the draft called me." She didn't speak, letting him continue if he wanted. "I came back to find the house caved in and the fields overrun. Started again here. I don't look back much. I think about my mother every day," she said. Not the pain, just her voice, the way she always knew when I was lying. "She'd be proud of you." "I hope so." The wind picked up, brushing over them with the scent of pine and distant smoke. Kierra turned her face into it, letting the breeze carry away the knot that had sat behind her ribs since the stranger's visit. That evening they walked the ridge above the creek, the sky streaked with gold and lavender. A pair of hawks circled high above, their cries sharp as flint. Kierra stopped beside a half-fallen juniper and leaned against it, watching the land below. "I want to be married to you," she said, her voice quiet but sure. Beau didn't move right away. Then he turned to her, the light catching the silver at his temple, the fine lines near his eyes. "You mean that?" "I do, not someday. Now." He stepped closer, resting a hand on her waist. "Then let's do it right. No paper promises swapped in secret. I want to stand beside you, proper and known." Her eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. "There's a traveling preacher coming through the valley next week. The marshal's wife told me. He does small services." "Then we'll ask him," Beau said, "and we'll do it here, not in town. Not where anyone can say a word that doesn't belong to us." They walked home in the fading light, their hands twined, the silence between them settled and warm. The day of the wedding came soft and bright. No guests, no bells. Just the preacher in a clean coat, the marshal and his wife standing witness, and the wind through the cottonwoods. Kierra wore a dress she'd sewn herself, simple calico with the hem raised for work. Beau wore the same shirt he'd worn the day he found her, newly mended at the cuffs. They stood beneath the tree near the fence line, the one she'd first leaned against when she healed. The preacher's words were brief. Beau's hand was steady in hers, his thumb brushing hers once as they said their vows. When it was done, he kissed her, not too long, not too soft, but full of everything that had been built between them. The marshal clapped Beau on the back and nodded at Kierra like she'd passed some test no one had put into words. That night their cabin felt different. Not new, but rooted. She lit the lamp and laid her hand on the table. The ring Beau had carved from bone and silver glinting in the firelight. "You know," she said as he stepped inside, "I think I'll plant more squash next year." He crossed the room, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "Whatever you plant, I'll build the fence for it." She smiled, wrapping her hands over his. "Then we'll have plenty." Years passed, but the rhythm of their life held steady. The garden grew wide and full. They added a smokehouse, a second coop, and a narrow room off the cabin for drying herbs and storing linens. Kierra learned to preserve peaches in summer and hang garlic through winter. Beau taught her how to read the cattle's moods by the shift of their ears, and she taught him to listen for bees before planting clover. They spoke less and understood more. When she laughed, it came from her belly. When he rested, it was with his boots off and his hand in hers. No one came looking again. They grew older. Lines came to their faces, joints stiffened, but they never left that land, never stopped tending it. They buried the mule one spring when the rains came late, and Beau carved a small marker for him under the willow. They planted more each year, more trees, more rows, more time. And when they sat together on the porch with the dusk stretching long and slow across the fields, he still looked at her like the day he found her under the cottonwood. Like she'd changed the shape of the earth just by staying, she had. And she always would.